Okay. All right. Can you? Okay, I can hear me. So, uh, thank you for having me. It's always good to come to Kentucky. I remember when I was finishing my graduate program, I looked around at the forage states, and I wanted to go to Kentucky, Georgia, Missouri, or A&M. Those were my four. Now, there are other good states. We got NC State represented in other places, but Kentucky's always had a history of forage know-how, and I just have always loved to come to this state. And I've got two daughters that graduated not far from here at Bowling Green, and one in agriculture. So thank you for having me. Also, would say at the beginning that this talk represents a lot of people, including Gene Schmitz from Missouri, who's not listed here, Matt, who's here. So anybody that's here, we've all worked together for many years in the lab and on the research station on the farm, and many qualified people to answer questions as best we can. So also, I'll say this. Okay, we're in this road show. We've been doing this now. This is our 7th year, and see a lot of things and exchange comments. One of the things that struck me this year was how unique novel endophytes are. We're here to talk about novel endophytes in tall fescue. Ever so often, there will be an advancement in any crop, Roundup Ready beans and so on. And in forages, we've had grazing type alfalfas that came out of Georgia, all these advancements, but not anything like this. This took one of our major grass in the eastern U.S., removed the toxicity, added the persistence back, and we have entered the forest of no return. We're not going to see, I don't believe, anything like this. I've never seen anything like this, and so I'm totally behind it, as my family. So anyways, let's go ahead and get started. It's always good to begin when you talk about anything like novel endophytes or a new tall fescue. It's always good to not assume. So we're going to go back and just highlight what we're talking about in terms of fescue toxicosis. It is the most devastating forage livestock disorder in Missouri by far. We have the number 2 beef herd in the U.S., so that affects a lot of cattle. So let's talk about toxicosis and how important this is. Yes, and so I'm going to need an antenna probably. It's green, and it's... Okay, here we go. Try that one. Okay. So this is where we tell a joke. Okay. So I won't tell a joke, but let me show you something here. Is this yours? This is okay. I'm going to grab a notebook there and show you something here that struck me. Yeah, my notebook here. And so as Ray told you, or Chris, that inside these came from Missouri, and so you'll need to pull out this page and use the agenda that was handed out. Also, you know it's from Missouri because the front cover is upside down. And we don't sweat the small stuff. So, yeah. Also, while we're waiting, let's see. While we're waiting, okay, good. Let's just go ahead and talk about this. This is an overview. It probably represents maybe 50 years worth of research, and several textbooks and journal articles. So we'll just go across the top of this. Fescue toxicosis. It's easiest to describe fescue toxicosis in terms of symptoms. And those symptoms are divided into veterinarian symptoms, in other words, herd health, and animal scientists or livestock production symptoms, okay? So let's talk veterinarians for a while. What are the herd health ones? One of the symptoms that we are unable to see, but is in all of our toxic fescue, one of the symptoms is vasoconstriction. So animals that are grazing toxic tall fescue will suffer from narrowing of the blood vessels. If it's this big around, they consume toxic tall fescue, all of a sudden it's that big around. What does that do? What's the problem with that? Okay, so it's going to limit circulation. And it will cause, as you say, fescue foot. In the wintertime, where I'm from, we have a lot of fescue foot. Matt's from North Carolina. He said, just Monday, he said, how many of you have fescue foot? Now, in North Carolina, maybe 2 or 3 people raise their hand. Over half, I would say 2/3, raise their hand. Fescue foot, if you get it, you're going to get it. It's Russian roulette. Just spin the cylinder. You pull that trigger, you're going to lose more than one animal. And so but it's not the most serious in terms of our production, but it is one of the most noticeable. The blood is not circulating to the extremities. We get temperatures in the teens. All of a sudden, that hoof will fall off. Also, the tips of the ears, switch of the tail. Also, because blood is not circulating, well, this is one of the effects anyway, we have poor thermoregulation. They're hotter in the summer and they're colder in the winter. In the summer, we notice that as heat stress. We have some other symptoms. I'm not going to talk about fat necrosis, but it's a well-known symptom that is obvious in an autopsy. Production, all of these herd health responses affect our dollars, okay? We have low feed intake and rate of gain. We have low birth weight and weaning weight. Typically, weaning weights are going to range from 50 pounds light to well over 100, 112, 115 pounds light. Over the past 5 years, I've seen thousands of weaning weight data. And even if there's variation in the herd, you will lose at least 50 pounds in weaning weight. That's on your best animals. Low breeding rate, okay, we'll talk about that. And birthing problems. We're going to see some examples of this. Poor milk production. Are you all cow-calf? Mostly? Okay. So think of this. When you're running a cow-calf operation, what do you want? Good repro, good milk production, of course, for the calves, and good gain. What is the problem with fescue toxicosis? Repro, milk production, and gain. Everything you want, forget about it. Everything you don't want, that's free. Here's some examples. There are many photos. We just show this all the time. Fescue foot, the hoof has come off. Here's an x-ray that we got from Maryland and Virginia. You can see over here on the left, a normal blood circulation. Okay, that's from a cow not on toxic fescue. Over on the right, you can see that the circulation stopped. Circulation stopped right here. And you can see the swelling. There'll be a necrotic ring somewhere down here, a dead ring. And this hoof of this animal fell off 2 or 3 days after the x-ray. And that's common. Okay, fat necrosis. Forgive me for skipping that. It's just, I'm going to move on here. These are fescue cattle. And this is in Mount Vernon, Missouri. And you can see up here the tree line. See up here. So you know that it's not winter. It's green trees. These are oaks. And all here, our pasture is dormant because of our annual drought that we have in Mount Vernon. And yet they have their winter hair coat. Scruffy cattle. Those cattle, by the way, the daily gain on that was 0 for 2 months. Hard to make money on stockers that way. Here are some data. These numbers could be multiplied and just come down the floor. This is just a sampling of maybe a third or a fourth of grazing data. So let's set the stage for the rest of the day. When we say red, what does red mean? And you're going to your bathroom faucet and you have red and blue. What's red mean? Okay, so this is hot fescue. Think of it, hot fescue. And we say E+. This is many times we're going to say E+. That means endophyte infected. Just to not assume, okay? So when we say endophyte, we're going to be covering this all day long. Tall fescue, many of you know it, some maybe not remember, but if you cut the tiller at the base of the plant, right at the root level, and then you peel it and look under the microscope, it's going to have an organism, a fungus growing in that. Right over here is a microscope from Noble Research Institute. This is Carolyn Young. And we would all like you to look into the scope and see the endophyte so that you know this is not book learning. It's real, and it's probably in all your fields. So anyway, endophyte infected. In other words, this is tall fescue that's infected with this fungus. the normal common fungus, and it's super toxic. So, and then we're going to compare it in this chart. We're going to compare it to endophyte free. In other words, some of my plants don't have this fungus. Very few, but some of them don't. So if I cut the plant and I look under the microscope, it's going to be all plant cells, but there's no fungus. All right? So we're going to say this several times. This is not something in Missouri, and I don't know how it is in Kentucky. You'll have to talk to the folks here, but we do not recommend endophyte free. Why is that? It doesn't last. It's exactly right. So we'll talk about that all day. However, for experimentation, we want to look at what the endophyte does. So we have a column of data here. These are steer gains from animals grazing toxic fescue. These are steer gains from animals grazing non-toxic fescue. Okay? So we'll be seeing this all day long. So what does it show? What does the table show? Well, if you look at the first one here, it shows steers are gaining 1 pound a day. This is in Texas. Over here, steers are gaining over 2 pounds a day. So take out the toxic endophyte, take out the toxic fungus, all of a sudden the steer gains doubled in this study. Here's Alabama. This trial, steers gained 1.4. Over here, well over 2. Let's say 2.2. And that would be typical. Here's a study in Georgia. They're gaining 1 pound a day. Over here, 1.3. Not so much of a bump. Here's a study in Alabama. 1 pound a day, 1 pound a day, 1 pound a day. You'll see this often. Now, there are some experiments where they gain less. You'll see that. But as a rule of thumb, if you look at most of our data where the steers have a long grazing season and they're on straight fescue, no clover, no feed additives, no supplement, no row grow, just straight grass, the steers typically at the end of the season will calculate out to 1 pound a day gain. If we move them to a non-toxic fescue, what we'll talk about later today, novel endophytes, but in this one, endophyte free, a non-toxic fescue, they're not gaining 1 pound a day anymore. They're gaining about 1.7, 1.6, 1.7, 1.8, something like that. It doesn't double, but it's a huge bump in production. So you see all this variation, but that's just a rule of thumb, okay? And let's point out that in your notebook, there's a typo. This is supposed to say E+. I think it says E- in your book. Sorry about that. It's been this way for 2 years now. So anyways, this is calving rate. This is calving rate. If you talk with your economists, no matter who they are, they'll tell you that in a cow-calf system in this part of the country, a couple of things really affect the pocketbook. Cow-calf, the number one thing is going to be calving rate. The other one is going to be winter feeding systems. But anyway, if you look here, this is calving rate on a non-toxic fescue. Look at that, 97, 98%, pretty good. Put them on toxic fescue, and it drops down to below 60, 55, 58, something like that. Now this work was done in Kentucky here, but there was another trial done at Alabama. They didn't cooperate with each other, just an independent study. 2 or 3 years later, had the same data. They have calving rate on non-toxic fescue. This can be novel endophyte or endophyte free as far as the animal performance. And the calving rate is just below 100, okay? 95 to 98, something like that. Put them on a non-toxic fescue, and it's 55 or 58. Now, you might say, my calving rate is not like that, and I have straight fescue, maybe a little clover. My calving rate is, 85 or something like that. That's probably true for a couple of reasons. This is straight grass, and that shows the effect of the endophyte. If you had feed and clover and all this going on, the calving rate wouldn't be quite as low. By the way, those are called input costs. It's not just management, they're input costs. But so there's a reason for this. This is what happens with straight fescue, toxic fescue, okay? Another reason is because these are probably, and I didn't check the studies, Jeff, probably spring calving herds. These are data that represent what we've seen. This is from Arkansas, but you can see in spring calving herds, in this trial, the calving rate was 44%. In this one, it was over 80, maybe 90, the fall calving. Spring calving has low. How many spring calve, by the way? Okay. How many do both? Okay, a lot of people do. This is from Susan Duckett, John's wife, and you see over here the effect that toxic fescue has on birth weight. These are lambs, okay? And if you look at the data here, you can see there's a 37% drop in birth weight simply because of toxic fescue. And we don't have weaning weight data. We need to probably start putting up weaning weight data. It's phenomenal on weaning weight. John, you want to talk about these rut pigs?
There was a study that looked at blood flow to the lamb. Vasoconstriction reduced that blood flow. We got some ultrasonography and a group at Lexington, USDA. Jimmy Boston done quite a bit of work. Matter of fact, been in Clemson twice this week. Matter of fact, this morning, using it as a model, and that toxic fescue. Wondering how this impacts those lambs, calves.
Mm-hmm. But they're
programmed.
Yeah. So again, we didn't present the milk production, but milk production, reproduction, and gain, weaning weight, birth weight, everything is devastated by this toxic endophyte. Want to stop and say something Matt Poore has been saying through all of these presentations. This is not intended to bash Kentucky 31 fescue. If we didn't have Kentucky 31, we wouldn't probably have soil in some of these regions because it's tremendous ground cover and has given us a cattle industry in some of these regions where we can't crop the land. So what's the cause? As we said earlier, the cause is this endophyte. So if we look under a microscope, now this is a special microscope, it's not stained like you'll see later. But if you look at it, between these cell walls, these are cells, between the plant cells is growing this organism here. Looks a little bit like yarn if you back off a little bit. This endophyte growing inside the plant produces these compounds here. I think I told this last year, but I asked a student one time, said, "Hey, I know what those are." What is that? What is that? He said, "That's 1,3-hydroxy chicken wire." Well, yeah. It's a class of compounds. You and I may see this just as a drawing, but a toxicologist will look at that and tell you right by looking at it, just like you can tell the difference between a Jersey and an Angus. They look at this and they think, you got to be kidding. You're feeding this to somebody? It is. They recognize it just like that as super toxic. It has a long history, even in human toxicity. So ergot alkaloids, very, very much of a problem. So this organism produces these compounds, all right? This organism, we'll have to talk a little bit about the biology because later when we talk about management, we have to know where the organism is and where the toxins are and so on. So this time of year, as it's greening up, the organism, this endophyte, is going to be growing down here in the base of the plant. It's there most of the year. But when the plant is reproductive, it's in the seed head. And it's still down here and throughout most of the crown and the stem and the seed head. But it's highly concentrated in the seed head, and you can see that here. You can see all this little squiggly that looks like the yarn. That's it growing in there. And then between these cells, these are aleurones, but these are special cells in the seed. Just look at how thick it is, okay? And so the seeds are very toxic. That doesn't mean that the solution is to clip, okay? That's part, you can do that, and it can help. But just to show how toxic the seeds are. This also could be done with many compounds besides ergovaline. But if you look at this, if you look at it, the toxins decrease, and right about now, we're in late March, they're fairly low coming out of winter. Then as the plant starts to grow, and especially, why would they be so high around May and June? Okay, so you got so many seed heads here. So toxins increase, and it's super toxic in May and June. All right, then it decreases again. People used to say, well, fescue is most toxic in the summer. And it's least toxic in the summer. But they've eaten all this here. There is a residual effect. They've eaten all this here, and it turns out to be 90, 100 degrees and humid. So that environment plus those toxins are in that animal. Later, I think it's Ray who's going to talk about this, but if we manage, we have to begin managing up here. We have to know it's toxic. We have to know it's toxic. We can't start managing here. It's a little late. Any gain you've lost, you've lost. You can't get that back with compensatory gain. It's gone.
Is that measured as intake by the animal or concentration plant?
Well, in this one, I think it's intake in the animal. But in the plant, it's the same. You'll see this, what we call the bimodal curve. So in the spring, it breaks dormancy, starts growing, and it becomes super toxic in the spring. It gets less toxic in the summer, and then there's a fall peak, and that's more difficult to manage. You can't just clip seed heads in the fall. You can't put clover in the fall. So the fall is sometimes hard to manage. But just remember, it will go up and peak sometime before Thanksgiving around here. Okay, this is just laying the groundwork for our management later. So again, as we talk about management, that's an entire talk. It's an important talk. When they talk about management later, I think it's Ray who's going to do this. So he'll talk about management of novel endophyte, management of toxic endophyte, and then management of the system. So each one of those is different. But management is going to follow this flow chart. Everybody in the room is somewhere on this flow chart, you know. So the first thing to do is to test. Now, most people have not. Has anybody tested their pastures for the endophyte? Okay, I don't see a hand in here. And that's pretty common. But you do need to probably know what's in there. You can assume it's toxic until you know otherwise, because that's true. But you may want to test if the cattle are performing extremely well. We do have a few pastures in Missouri that have low endophyte level. What's low? Low is like 15 to 20. Low is not 35 or whatever. Low is well below 20. If you have low, you can keep it. So Ray will go through all this. What we're talking about today is mainly this. We were talking about replacing toxic fescue with a non-toxic type, but not endophyte free. We're talking about replacing it with a non-toxic infected variety. And then the other fields, if we don't replace them all, we have to manage those. This will all be covered later. Now, here's the last slide, I think, of my part here. This is an important slide. Students will always say, do I have to know this for the test? Do I have to know this for the test? You have to know this for the test. The test of life. This is one of our most important slides. Is that really not counting turf types. In pastures, there are three kinds of tall fescue. There's Kentucky 31 that we have here. Our old standby, been reliable for many years, but has caused all of our problems. More problems caused on fescue toxicosis than any forage I work with. And cost money. Then we had these that were released in the 80s and some in the 90s, and they mostly died. And then we have novel. The reason for saying that, because I won't be up here again to say it, is at the end of this talk, some people will want to go and plant a novel. They may have 200 acres. They want to try 15 acres. They want to go plant a novel endophyte. They'll go to the store, and whoever's behind the counter will sell you endophyte free and tell you it's the same thing. So just remember, and this happens all the time to us. We've even posed as farmers and calling, hey, I want to get some novel endophyte, just to see what they would say. And I won't tell you what they said because it's being recorded. But it is not good. So please remember, we've got three types, and that'll set the stage for the rest of the day. So I want to stop and see, is there a question? And feel free to ask a quick question on this. Yes, sir. Hay, As a rule of thumb, when you cut hay, a third is gone in 3 weeks and half is gone in half a year. It's not linear. As soon as you cut it, it starts disappearing because of the heat, the wind in the windrow, and the heat, the wind, and the light will decompose. But by the time you feed it in the winter, half is gone, and then it stays about that way. Baleage, okay, if you roll it up wet and bale it either in haylage or in a tube, you're preserving the toxins. One toxin may get less concentrated, and then these other toxins are more concentrated. But baleage or ensiling is a way to preserve toxins. No, it's natural. All of these organisms come from the Mediterranean, and they're brought over and physically injected into the plant. And Carolyn is an expert at this. Carolyn from Noble, she can. Sir? Just the organism, just the endophyte, just the fungus. Yes. So they take the fungus. Yes. Endophyte freeze created either by storage, incubators, or fungicides. And then novel endophytes and ryegrass happened well before 1989. I saw the first paper from Gary Latch, 1989, in New Zealand. But the first one was Max Q, tall fescue, in the 90s. Who is going to give us a date? Where's Chris? When did Max Q come out? On the shelf. 99. And there are many. The companies later are going to give a lot of data on this. They're very, very well vetted. Very well vetted. Okay, so there's no such thing as resistance, but there's variation in the herd. And so there's some level of tolerance in the herd with individual animals. Well, Matt, let Matt answer about crossbreeding and Cinepole.
Yeah, so there are, we know there's different tolerance. One thing that was quite interesting now is there's well-known Cinepole is getting that in. There will be some advances.
One of the things to remember is the genetic tolerance will help you recover some of that loss, but not all of it. It's true. I work some with this stuff, so I've seen a lot of data on it. But it's true that the only cure and true silver bullet is a novel endophyte. I mean, it's just incredible. All that stuff you worry about, repro, even stockpiling, even fertilizing, totally not a problem. One more question, I think. Yes? Yeah. Yeah. While he's changing slides, yes? Why is Kentucky 31 still sold? I think because it's cheap. It's easy to get a stand. We plant it on our roadsides. It's good for road stabilization. And there's a tradition. Okay, there's a heritage here. I thank you for your time. And Matt and John, a lot of folks will be around to help today.